Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is Elder Statesman Finally. The year is 1945, and Franklin Roosevelt has just taken his oath of office for the fourth time as President of the United States. War in Germany seems like it's about to end in favor of the Allies, but Roosevelt would not live to see it. Just over a month into that fourth term, he passed away, at which point his longtime antagonist, Herbert Hoover, issued the following statement. The nation's sorrows at the passing of its president, whatever differences there may have been, they end in the regrets of death. Also a possibility for Hoover now to possibly reemerge with the passing of Roosevelt and perhaps getting a connection with the new president, Harry Truman. And the person trying to make that connection initially was Henry Stimson. Stimson had been Hoover's Secretary of State. He was now Truman's Secretary of War after serving in that role for Roosevelt for a number of years. And he was trying to get them together, and Hoover was very interested, but he also didn't want to seem to be pushy on the new president. So he was telling Stimson, you know, a lot better if maybe the president would write me a letter and give me a formal invitation. And actually, Harry Truman was fine with doing that. Just about a month after becoming president, he wrote to Hoover, if you should be in Washington, I would be most happy to talk over the European food situation with you. Also, it would be a pleasure for me to become acquainted with you. Well, 4 days later, Herbert Hoover was in the White House for the first time in over a dozen years. A substantive discussion with the new president. They talked about how to win the peace, overcome the inevitable chaos which was about to ensue in Europe once the war was over, and how to feed a starving continent, which again, Hoover knew was inevitable after his experience at the end of World War I. Also, while he favored demilitarizing Germany, he warned the new president not to destroy the German economy, not to repeat those mistakes from the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. For Hoover, that would simply open the door to the communists, which was something to avoid. Well, Germany did surrender actually in relatively short order. Japan was still holding out until President Truman gave the order to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the empire then capitulated. Herbert Hoover was not a fan of this new weapon. He called it the most terrible and barbaric weapon that has ever come to the hand of man. Despite any sophistries, its major use is not to kill fighting men, but to kill women, children, and civilian men of whole cities as a pressure on governments. If it comes into general use, we may see all civilization destroyed. Well, a few months later, President Truman was back in touch. He wanted Hoover to go to Europe and again assess the food situation, come back with recommendations. He made him the head of the Famine Emergency Commission, and Hoover was glad to respond. In fact, before leaving for Europe, he issued a call to the American people. Today we must transform the world from this era of killing to an era of saving lives. Saving of human life is a moral and spiritual duty. These starving women and children are in foreign countries, yet they are hungry human beings, and they are also your neighbors. Will you not take to your table an invisible guest? Hoover was energized by this opportunity. He's 73 years old, but he was acting like a young man, going to 22 countries in 57 days, nonstop travel, nonstop meetings, crunching numbers, trying to figure out how to get at least 1,500 calories a day into the lives of these starving people. Who had the most supply? Who had the greatest need? 40 million children were at risk, according to his estimates. Came back, briefed the president, briefed Congress, and said, look, I would recommend $425 million to go to feed the people in the U.S. and British occupied territories in Europe. He helped establish the Children's Feeding Program to get a hot meal to 3.5 million children every day. This became a precursor to the UNICEF program under the United Nations, which operates still in 190 countries today. Back to a lot of the heroics of his earlier career, coming back for Herbert Hoover. A few months, President Truman asked him again to go back to Europe, to go into Germany, to go into Austria, maybe try to see what we can do to keep them from going over to the communist side. Came back once again, lobbying Congress for support in relief. Even those who believe in vengeance and punishment of a great mass of Germans not concerned in the Nazi conspiracy can now have no misgivings, for all of them in food, warmth, and shelter have sunk to the lowest level known in 100 years of Western history. If Western civilization is to survive in Europe, it must also survive in Germany, and it must be built into a cooperative member of that civilization. That indeed is the hope of any lasting peace. Now, Germany was in the process of splitting, the East going to the communists, the West being aligned with the Western democracies. The first chancellor of the democratic West Germany was Konrad Adenauer, and he was certainly appreciative of all that Hoover had done throughout his whole life on behalf of his country. He told Hoover, "For us Germans, your name is an epitome of the most striking qualities of the American people. It personifies for us the pluck of your pioneers who opened up the great wide spaces of your country, the faith in creative power of the free human personality, the respect for the rights of every individual, and the truly Christian love of fellow man." That was what Adenauer told Hoover. Now, for all of Hoover's efforts here in support of Harry Truman had a gift in return. This goes back to something that had happened early in the Roosevelt administration, with the dedication by the Interior Secretary Harold Ickes of the new dam that had been built on the Colorado River outside of Las Vegas. Now, this was a dam that Herbert Hoover had sort of helped envision when he was Secretary of Commerce. He advocated for as president. He was not invited to the dedication, at which time Ickes and Franklin Roosevelt, who presided over that dedication, named it the Boulder Dam. Now, it had always been known as the Hoover Dam. In fact, in several appropriations in Congress, it had been known as the Hoover Dam, but not once the Roosevelt administration came in. Kind of a petty move on their part, they decided to call it the Boulder Dam. Well, Harry Truman decided to essentially correct the record. In April of 1947, he lobbied Congress and signed into legislation that massive new structure powering energy and water to 6 different states in the West would forever be known as Hoover Dam. A nice gesture, and putting Hoover right back to work immediately after that as well, because he now had another big job for Herbert Hoover. They called it the Commission on the Organization of the Executive Branch, but everybody knew it forevermore as the Hoover Commission. The idea was to look at these inefficiencies that had grown up over time in sort of an unwieldy executive branch, make recommendations on how to improve things going forward. Now, this is something that Hoover had actually been interested in, but most of Congress had never really given it much appetite. And so this time, Truman helped establish the commission. He said, "Come back with your recommendations, but we'll do it after the 48 election to try to take politics out of things." Now, when Hoover had been president, there had been about 600,000 federal employees working in about 350 federal agencies. Now, in the late 1940s, there were over 2 million workers in the federal government and over 1,800 agencies. Overlap, duplication, inefficiency, this is what Hoover was asked to sort out. Well, this was a perfect task for the great engineer, looking at data, doing analysis, coming up with solutions. He put in place 19 task forces. He hired 300 experts, almost all of whom he hired personally. There were many other notable members, like on the commission, you've got the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, a former ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, the father of the future president. They were all involved in bits and pieces of the commission, but Hoover was the one who had his hand in just about every aspect of this. In fact, he wrote many of the reports that started coming out in February of 1849 with 280 recommendations to streamline and gain efficiencies in the executive branch. Part of the attraction for Hoover here is, look, he was able to tear down some of the stuff that had been put up in the New Deal, which he didn't agree with, and now with great satisfaction, some of that was coming undone because over 70% of the recommendations from this commission were adopted by the Congress and by the president. A lot of high praise for Hoover in his personal engagement in doing this, which felt good after an election cycle in which he was once again left out. In the 1848 election, he did speak at the Republican convention again, but Thomas Dewey, who won that nomination, did what the previous nominees, Alf Landon, Wendell Willkie, didn't want to have anything to do with Herbert Hoover. And Hoover was disappointed by this. He said that I really believe that by 1948, the people of this country had reestablished me in their affection, but apparently the governor held to the opinion that I was still political poison. This was a close race, came down to the wire, Harry Truman narrowly winning a 4-year term of his own. This is all heading into the last stage of Herbert Hoover's life, and he had a chance to sort of bask in the glow of the Hoover Commission activity and his recent work in Europe when 12,000 people showed up on the Stanford campus at Frost Amphitheater to celebrate Hoover's 75th birthday. Millions more were listening on the radio. He gave an address, Think of the Next Generation, in which he said, "We must wish to maintain a dynamic, progressive people. No nation can remain static and survive, but dynamic progress is not made with dynamite, and that dynamite today is the geometric increase of spending by our governments, federal, state, and local. In the end, these solutions of national national problems by spending are always the same. Power, more centralization in the hands of the state. These were familiar themes, all things to be avoided as far as Herbert Hoover was concerned. He was glorified there in his 75th birthday, and in fact got a lot of positive press around the country, people talking about vindication for Herbert Hoover and the chance that he's lived to see it. Kind of an up note at this point. But people still want to know, he's 75 years old. Are you planning to retire? He said, no chance. I have not retired and don't intend to, he said. There's no joy to be had from retirement except in some kind of productive work. Otherwise, you degenerate into talking to everybody about your pains and pills, and the other fellow talks about his. Any oldster who keeps it even part-time work has something worth talking about. He has a zest for the morning paper and his 3 meals a day. The point is not to retire from work, or you will shrivel up a nuisance to all mankind. Herbert Hoover wasn't going to do that because he still worked about 12 hours a day. He had 4 secretaries working nonstop. Mostly he was busy writing articles, writing books, responding to letters. He would personally respond to about 30,000 letters each year. In terms of the books, he finally came out with his 3-volume memoirs, an extensive back and forth and from his perspective on the relationship and ideas and ideals of Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, all in volume 3. Interesting perspective there. He then also issued a 4-volume book called An American Epic, focused on food relief by the Americans dating from 1914 all the way to 1960. For a lot of time then, he was working on what he called his magnum opus, which was a book that didn't get published until long after his death. It eventually was called Freedom Betrayed, and this was basically an attack, slamming Franklin Roosevelt for his policies during and before and during World War II, particularly the ability or the outcome that allowed the communists to emerge in the post-war domination of Eastern Europe. A lot of blame thrown into this, but again, this book published well after Hoover had passed from the scene. Herbert Hoover was a Cold Warrior at heart. Long before the Cold War actually began, he was weary of the communists and their advance. In fact, now after the war and after some time had passed, he was actually looking to kick communist countries out of the United Nations. He didn't think that they belonged, and if they weren't willing to go, his advocacy was, well, we'll set up our own version of the United Nations and not invite the communist countries. So again, this was consistent for him. He saw communism as sort of the opposite of his beliefs in the American ideals that he had long espoused in individual liberty. Things would persist, but these were the advocacy of Herbert Hoover when it came to communism. Well, in the 1952 election, Hoover again had his choice. He often chose Robert Taft, the conservative from Ohio, to be the standard bearer. Never got the nomination. He was also okay, perhaps, with Douglas MacArthur, who had become living with him or near him in the Waldorf Astoria in New York, but neither of them got the nomination. It went to Dwight Eisenhower. And originally, Hoover was not a fan. He didn't think that Eisenhower was conservative enough and was really ready to be president of the United States. But when he got the nomination, actually Hoover was reached out to by Ike. And Ike really wanted Hoover to be engaged. He appreciated that. He supported his election in the fall. He was happy to go to his first inauguration in about 20 years when Eisenhower was inaugurated in March of 1953. And he welcomed the fact that Eisenhower really wanted to talk to him. Eisenhower reached out a number of times to get Hoover's opinion, made him feel good, made him feel like he belonged in that role of elder statesman. And then there was another job to do, the second Hoover Commission. Eisenhower again got Congress to approve another look at the executive branch. This one was slightly different. Not just on who does what, which was the focus of the first commission, but whether the federal government should be doing the work at all, which was more the focus of the second commission. Now again, they came up with hundreds of recommendations, but only about 30% of these were implemented. And Hoover thought Ike didn't really push hard enough, but the fact was these were very controversial moves. They really didn't have the votes. They got some of their recommendations in place, but not nearly as successful as the first commission had been. Well, there were 2 more Republican conventions for Herbert Hoover as he continued to live on. He spoke in 56, he spoke in 1960, a fitting final speech on a theme that was near and dear to the heart of Herbert Hoover. The spiritual force of which I speak is enshrined in the word America. We do not use that word merely as a geographical term. At one time, and even now for millions of Americans, that word summoned to mind the whole background of our nation. For centuries, the word America among the great masses of people over the world has been an emblem of hope, of more security in life, and more freedom. The word America means that our wars were not fought for the glory of war, but for freedom in the world. It means a country where the doors of opportunity are open to every boy and girl. It means law and order, freedom of choice and callings. It means glorious strides in the advancement of civilization. America. To Herbert Hoover, this was what really he had always been about, and what he was about right up until the end. He finally passed in October of 1964. He witnessed the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He saw Douglas MacArthur pass just before him, and in October, his body finally gave out at the age of 90. Herbert Hoover had been the great engineer, the great humanitarian. He was a hero to the American people, and then he became President of the United States. The Great Depression came on, and he was turned into a villain. Finally, late in his life, he was able to emerge as an elder statesman, but he really didn't change much throughout that entire cycle. The Quaker ethics he had from his youth, his belief in American individualism, the American dream, voluntary service to the community, the limited role of the U.S. government, even in the toughest times, these were consistent themes of Herbert Hoover throughout his life. Many times it served him well, sometimes not so much. Biggest problem for Herbert Hoover was he wasn't a very good politician. He only ran for office twice. Once he was elected president, once he lost his re-election for president. That was his entire political experience. And in office, he just didn't have a lot of the connections to people that politicians sort of used to their advantage. He was too analytical, too secretive. He didn't make those personal connections, and he was ripe for the propaganda machine that the Democrats, Charlie Michelson, Franklin Roosevelt, would lay on Hoover over and over again. Certainly one of the lessons of the Hoover administration is the effectiveness of the propaganda from the other side. Herbert Hoover was admired, he was loathed, he was admired again late in life, and at least he lived long enough to feel at least some of that vindication for his service to his country, service to the people of the world. That is Herbert Hoover, elder statesman, finally, from the life of Herbert Hoover. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.